Buenas tardes. My name is Edgar Palacios. I'm the founder of Revolución Educativa, an organization created to build a sustained collective power within the Latino community around issues of education. I am joined this evening by my daughter, Isabel. Isabel decided that she wanted to be a host this evening, and so she's going to be sticking around with us. Maybe she'll disappear for a little bit. Who knows? But anyways, I just want to welcome you all to this conversation. We have an incredible opportunity today to connect with our friends at the Cesar Chavez Foundation, particularly Paul Chavez and Celia Garcia Alvarado. And so I'm excited to bring them on so we can talk about the power of Latino activism, the roots, a little bit about our history, where we're headed as well. But before we even do that and introduce our friends today, I just want to go ahead and play a quick video from the Cesar Chavez Foundation.
From anyone else who has ever tried to accomplish something with his life. My motivation comes from my personal life, from watching what my mother and father went through when I was growing up. That dream, that vision grew from my own experience with racism, with hope, with a desire to be treated fairly and to see my people treated as human beings and not as chattel.
In 1962, my father began working with the poorest of this nation's poor. His work continues today through the ongoing work of the Cesar Chavez Foundation. Tens of thousands of hardworking men and women, children and seniors live and thrive in our affordable housing communities throughout the Southwest. Our standards-based, rigorous academic programs, coupled with our enrichment programs that educate the heart, prepare thousands of students from over 50 school districts to meet tomorrow's challenges. Through the airwaves, Radio Campesina entertains and educates over 500,000 daily listeners. But our work doesn't stop there. Our call to action strengthens and improves our communities. At the National Chavez Center, activists and leaders can come and receive training and preparation so that they can go back to their communities and be agents of social change.
Damas y caballeros, qué rollo, muy buenos días. Esto es Campesino y nomás con su compa el Alacrán en la estación fundada por Cesar Chavez Racilla.
You know, when I talked to Cesar Chavez about Radio Campesina, he described it perfectly. A Spanish-speaking station that really caters to the new arrivals. Cesar would go out to different radio stations, buy airtime from the radio stations, and he would say, you know, we're always getting these bad times early in the morning or after midnight on the station. So he goes, I wonder what it would be like to own our own radio station. I wonder what it would be like to have our own voice on the airwaves. And that's where Radio Campesina was created.
Well, we're going to go ahead and continue moving forward. It is my honor tonight to bring on Paul Chavez and Celia Garcia Alvarado. How are y'all doing this evening? Bienvenidos.
Good, Edgar. We're happy to be with you. We're excited about the work that you do, and we hope that we can collaborate with you all.
Awesome.
Yes, thank you for the invitation.
We will also play another video at the end of this broadcast to make sure that we get the right information out to our community. But before we even do that, I would just love to learn a little bit more about both of you. So, Paul, tell us a little bit more about your history.
Well, you know, I'm one of the 8 children of Cesar and Helen Chavez, and you know, I grew up in the Farmworkers movement. You know, this is the life that we've known. It's the only life that we know, I should say. And you know, we learned at an early age that things in our household were a little bit different than a lot of our friends. We learned at an early age that we would need to share my father with other people that were looking for his attention and his support. And so we grew up in that environment where we were able to witness a lot of history that was being made. You know, we had the benefit of meeting a lot of famous people, but more importantly, for me, I was able to engage with the folks that my father dedicated his life to, and so it's been a It's been a fulfilling life, rewarding life. You know, the last about 30 years, I've focused on the work of the Cesar Chavez Foundation, which is it's a 501c3 that's dedicated to addressing needs that working people have outside the workplace. My father believed, he understood that workers just aren't workers, that after a long, hard day's work in the fields or in the factories, that people go home to whole different sets of problems. The lack of affordable housing, quality educational opportunities for our children, access to fair consumer credit, and a whole list of issues. And so the Cesar Chavez Foundation is the part of the farmworker movement that addresses those needs in the community.
Celia, why don't you share a little bit more about who you are as well?
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for the opportunity to join you this evening. I grew up in South Los Angeles, previously known as South Central Los Angeles. And so I'm the daughter of Mexican immigrant parents who came here, you know, for opportunity, right? I think that that's kind of a story that kind of resonates across a lot of immigrant families. And so I think the irony is that we ended up in South Central Los Angeles, right? Just given the opportunities and resources that are there. But at a young age, I would say that maybe 11, 12, I actually knew that I wanted to be in education because I had the opportunity to go to an all-girl private school that was very different than my home school. And so as a young child, my mom would drive myself and spend about maybe 3 hours in the car every day. And so I always tell folks that I developed a very healthy anger in that commute, because I often question why. First of all, why do I have to drive so far, right? And second of all, I was really curious about how resources and opportunity was structured, right? They were structured in very curious ways. And at that level, or at that age, I didn't know the language around, you know, inequity, but I knew something was wrong, right? Because I had to travel so far to get an excellent education, while, you know, my friends, my family were just on a very different kind of trajectory. But I think that experience for me really cemented why I needed to be in education. And so I knew, you know, back then that that's what I wanted to do. And so I did become a teacher. I worked for LA Unified, and then I've worked for a couple of nonprofits after that, really in the area of instruction, developing and coaching teachers, leading teams. And so now I'm here and I have the privilege of leading all of our education efforts for the Education Fund.
It's so important. So for information for folks joining us this evening, Revolución Educativa is a 501c4 organization that's focused on building power around issues of education, but it's the sister organization of the Latinx Education Collaborative, where we're focusing on increasing the number of Latino teachers in K-12. And so we understand that when our students see themselves reflected in the teachers that serve them, they have better educational outcomes, have better educational experiences. And so we also know that we're building on the shoulders of giants. And so I really appreciate the work that you both are doing to continue in this movement. Paul, I have a question for you. As you think about your father's legacy, how do you define it? What does that mean to you today?
Well, you know, it's a really good question, because it's something that we've had to wrestle with, you know, as we do our daily work. You know, we're aware that my father's legacy can stimulate a lot of folks to go out and be of service to their community and do things that maybe they never considered that they can do, or what they've been told they can't do. And so we know that part of his legacy can inspire people to do things, just like my father did with Farmworkers, when he challenged one of the strongest and most powerful industries in the state of California, and they prevailed. But we also know that you also need to make substantive community change. And so, you know, as we did our own planning, going through our own strategic planning, you know, we came up with the core purpose of inspiring and transforming communities. We know that you have to get people to believe in themselves and believe that they can make a difference. But also, at the end of the day, you got to go out and you got to change and transform communities. And so, when I think about my father's legacy, it's those both ends. It's those two ends of it, that we inspire people, but also at the end of the day, we go out and we make a difference in the communities in which we live. And I think that if we do that, then we honor my father's legacy in the way that he would be happiest with.
Celia, I'm curious, as you work at the foundation, how do you see that legacy kind of live in the day to day?
Yeah, well, like I said, I do have the privilege of leading all of the education efforts. And, when I think about the work that I lead, right, I really think about, what Paul is saying around, his father really understanding like all of these oppressive, conditions that, farm workers were really facing. And one of those really thinking about, lack of access to education or educational opportunities. And so, from that standpoint, I always think about, the opportunity gap, right? And really figuring out, what is our role, and understanding that there is systemic racism, right? There's all of these different isms that are really making it really difficult for our students to thrive. And so the work that we do is really from the lens of how do we educate hearts and minds, right? Thinking about children in a holistic, humane manner, and doing so through culturally responsive and diverse products and services. That's really the lens that we think it through, right? Because I think in everything that we do, we want people to feel seen, to feel heard, right? And in a very similar fashion to how Cesar really led, right? And made him really relatable. And so that, I think, is really the connection around the way that we think about it, and really taking a entrepreneurial approach, because we know that the system currently is not working. It was never designed to work for all children to succeed. So how do we really think about that and understand that, and then really build on Cesar's legacy, because he was a big proponent of education. And so that is something that we really want to make sure that we carry on that legacy and build upon it in that same kind of, I think, approach.
Yeah, that's really powerful work. And you said something that like makes me think around making Cesar relatable. And so, Paul, I'm going to ask you this question. You got to clearly see a very different side of your father that maybe the nation didn't see. And so, would you be willing to give us some insight into who your father was as a father?
My dad was a real traditional Latino father, right? He was strict. He wanted us to if we had chores, that we would do our chores, and that if we worked, that we worked hard. He didn't like people that that didn't put their all into it, right? And so he was that kind of father that many of us have, and he was funny because he was pretty progressive in his thinking, but also with my sisters, he was very a strict father, right? You want to go to the dance? Fine. Take your sister. I want you home by 11 o'clock. And if he was in town, he'd be waiting for them to come home. So he there was that part of him, but then there was another part of him that really believed in the ability of everybody. And I experienced it firsthand in my own interaction with him, where throughout my working years with him, he always challenged me to do more than what I thought he could do. And I've been telling people that at first, I thought it was just the love that a father has for a child. But, in these years that since his passing, we've gone to many communities across the nation, and I've met a lot of folks who have talked about how he impacted them. And invariably, that hope and confidence that he had in me, he had in a lot of people. People tell me stories about how there was a woman who mentioned that she met my dad when she was growing up, and she told my father she wanted to be a teacher's aide, and she said that he pulled her aside. He like la regañó, hey, you should set your bars higher. You can do more than that. And she says, I never really thought that I could do more than that. And so she went on and she got her teaching credential, but she continued. She got her master's in education, and now she's an administrator at a community college in Southern California. Or the son of a striking farm worker that my father urged to be an attorney, and now he's a Superior Court judge in the county where everything started. So when I hear those stories, then I realize that it was more than just the love that a father had for his son. It was the hope and confidence that he had in an entire community. and an entire people's ability to
I think Paul paused just for a little bit there. Celia, while the internet works to reconnect, I'm curious, as an educator, what attracted you to working to the foundation?
I mean, I think first and foremost, right, who the founder was, Cesar himself. And I think that ultimately I knew that wherever I wanted to go and really kind of live out, my hope and dreams for myself, I just wanted to really believe in the mission of the organization and believe in the leadership. And I think, and also really think about, the core values that drive, people to really, work towards achieving that mission and vision. And for me, the foundation is kind of checks off all of those boxes, right? Where I really could see myself, first of all, like jumping out of bed and not have it feel like it's a job. It's actually more than a job, right? To me, it's a calling. It's like really like the purpose behind why I make the choices that I make, right? And being able to do the work that I do. So yeah, for me, all of those kind of boxes were checked off. And then we kind of laugh about this, but we have a big goal in our education fund to drive towards impacting 1 million learners by 2028, which is a tall order, right? And Paul sometimes jokes that I think a person can look at that and be like, "What? I don't think so. Not for me." But when I heard about, first of all, like saw the number and understood the why, that was so compelling. It was really compelling. It was bold, and I just said to myself, like, I have to really, let me just interview and like see where this goes. But it just, to me, that was just such an important statement around wanting to double down and also really, see education as a civil rights issue. So that to me is really what, compelled me to join.
One of the things that I think is really powerful of the work that the foundation is doing is, one, really talking about our history, right? And I often think about my own educational experiences about, even as I navigated spaces like Spokane, Washington, and small towns like Cape Girardeau, Missouri, where the Latino community isn't as strong, so to speak, there was always this lack of history around who our civil rights leaders were, right? How they were fighting for some of these issues and in service of our community. Paul, I'm really curious, as you think about the history of Latino activism and Latino leaders in this space, why do you think we don't know more of other folks? Because I'm sure your father wasn't alone in the fight, but oftentimes, we hear Cesar Chavez, we hear Dolores Huerta, and maybe in Missouri we don't hear about other people as well. So curious as if you find that to be true as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's an issue that we face, that we all face. And I think a big part of it, is attributed to what's being taught in our schools, what's being taught and what's not being taught. Mm-hmm. And so, one of the things that we do is we go out and we participate in different commemorations from my father's life. We remind people that, my father didn't do this work by himself. There was thousands and thousands of people that have made tremendous contributions, but whose names are largely lost to history. And so it's important that we go out and we talk about those folks that made contributions, not just people in the farmworker movement, but we were this weekend we were at a memorial service for Esteban Torres, a pioneering Latino congressman from California, right? And the story goes on and on and on. We can talk about Reyes Tejerina in New Mexico and Jose Angel Gutierrez and all these folks that did a lot of work to raise the Chicano consciousness of the 70s and 80s. And so that work needs to be done. And I think that's one of the things that we're so excited about when we develop our curriculums. It gives us an opportunity to develop culturally sensitive materials that can help kids understand that there's people that look just like them, that come from the same backgrounds, that were able to make tremendous contributions. And the second you do that, the light goes on and people say, if Cesar Chavez or Dolores Huerta can do it, maybe I can do it. And that's the goal of our work, is to get people thinking bigger about their future.
I'm excited about 1 million students to be inspired and to be either local activists in their schools, right, in their classrooms. I often think about activism can happen anywhere, right? It doesn't have to be sometimes as big or extravagant like acts. It can happen in like advocating for yourself, for the resources that you need in a classroom or for the books that you need in order to be a better scholar. Celia, 1 million students is a large goal. How do you think you're going to get there? What's the plan of getting there?
Yes, that's the question, right? That I go to sleep at night, I wake up, I keep thinking about that. But I think what we know for sure where we want to play. So really the focus is on pre-K all the way to 8th grade, right? So we are very intentional about what students, and then of course their families, just given the age group. And we know that it has to be a diversified portfolio. So I'm talking about building out an enterprise, right, where it's going to take different products and programs. And the way that we think about it right now is that we're in the world of like piloting ideas and then figuring out, is there a pathway right now to hit at least 100,000, right? So if I kind of do the math and I backwards plan from 1 million, then I'm like, okay, I have to figure out a pathway for 10 different, products or services. And right now, we are building out, and I'm really excited to share this, but we are in the space of building out curricula, right? So really thinking about culturally responsive curriculum. And here, our first unit is in connection to Cesar Chavez himself, and it's an argumentative, project-based curriculum, which is really actually driving a lot of interest and I think demand, right? So if we think about that and think about, okay, how can we bring that to as many students as possible? We know that we want to be not only, of course, in agricultural communities, but we actually want to make sure that this comes out to urban areas as well, right? So the way that we think about it is, how do we build partnerships? How do we build, intentional coalitions with folks to be able to get our products out there in order for it to really be meeting the needs, right, of kids that we actually really, I think, innovate for. Like, those are our end users. And so I try to, in my head, try to chunk it, right? And I think it's maybe not so hard, but I have a wonderful team. I have an innovation team, and we're working on different ideas, right? And we bring in Paul when we need to like get his feedback and even get a little bit of like our confidence going, and just kind of, channel our si se puede attitude when we need to. But, I think that, folks are really open to working with us, which I think is, I think such an important, I think, kind of ingredient in our work. And so that has been really refreshing and very welcomed. And so I'm very confident that I think that we can get there.
I love that. I'm inspired by this. I think that this is such a great opportunity for our community, and I'm so glad to see it, right? Particularly when we're entering some spaces across the country where we're talking about critical race theory and other kind of, social emotional learning and a backlash to some of those topics. But again, important for us to see our history, right? Important for us to see ourselves reflected in the curricula and in these ways. Paul, I'm curious. I've heard it called the racial reckoning, right, through the pandemic and whatnot. Do you think your father would have been proud of the progress that has been made, or do you think that he would have been disappointed by what's still happening in our country today?
I had conversations about that with him, before his passing, and I was impatient and I felt things weren't happening fast enough, and he would remind me that that our work, like also, it's over the long haul. It doesn't happen one day to the next. It happens so long as you show up to work every day and you continue the struggle. And so yeah, there's been a lot of progress. I mean, I look at my father's life. He served his country, went to the Navy, and when he came home on leave, he took my mom on a date to the Delano Theater, and they had the audacity to sit in the center section of the Delano Theater. It was reserved for white people. Mexicanos and Filipinos and blacks were supposed to sit on the sides. But he's wearing his uniform, and he's thinking, how can this be? I'm out serving my country, yet I can't sit here. And so he ended up being arrested, but he was like a lot of those other servicemen that came back after they served their country and began to question why were our kids going to segregated schools. The case there in Westminster in Orange County, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why do we live on the other side of the tracks, and why do we? And so they began to question all those issues. And so, from his lifetime, there was a tremendous change. I mean, a lot has happened. We take a look at the gains that farm workers have won, and they're meaningful. They have workman's compensation, they have water, and they have bathroom breaks and those basic necessities. But he would be the first to say there's a lot of work to be done. So while he would be pleased with what's happened, he would be the first one to say that nos queda mucho para hacer. And I think that that's how we need to pace ourselves in the movement. He would remind us that our la causa, our work, isn't like a baseball game where after 9 innings, whoever has the most runs wins and the other loses. It's not a political campaign where on election day, whoever has the most wins and the other loses. That in la causa, you only lose when you stop fighting. You only lose when you give up. You only lose when you quit. And so that was how he paced himself. He knew that so long as you're struggling and you're fighting, and you have groups like Revolución Educativa, then we're winning this fight.
I had to take a second just to take that in. And often the struggle is a struggle, right? There's a lot of people out here who don't see the need for the activism or the voices that we want to offer. Don't see the need for our Latino parents to get engaged in any shape, way, or form. But what you just said is really powerful, which is the fight ends when we give up, or if we continue to subsist and to struggle and to do the work, it continues. And I think that is a very part of it feels relief, right? In showing up, we're doing the work. And that's just I appreciate you saying that.
Well, the thing is, it's empowering, right?
Yeah.
And when you look at it from that point of view, then you see that the ability to change our community doesn't come from the outside. It's a responsibility and it's a duty that falls on our lap. And then what I've seen is that working people, farm workers, immigrants, we all want a better life for our children. It's amazing what people have done. They left their home countries to come here seeking a better future. And so if there's one thing that that immigrants and farm workers and working people know how to do is they know how to aguantar, they know how to work, they know how to stick with it. And then it's within our power to go out and make a change.
So many questions that I have, but I can't formulate them just yet. Celia, as you do this work, what is your vision for what's possible here for our community? What drives you to work every day?
I mean, I think that is that hope, right? I think what Paul has shared is it's that sentiment. I think that I didn't know it at the time, but when I decided to join the foundation, I think that to some degree, not that I had lost hope, but I needed to feel that fire again, right? And I think that this long-term view around it, it's only over, right, when you give up. I think that to me is just so energizing, and I love that you said, there's a sense of relief, but it's also this understanding of it's a choice to show up every single day, right? And it's a choice to work with others and not feel that you're by yourself, and understand that you have a community, right? Folks are leading, folks are following, and sometimes you're leading, sometimes you're following. But that I think is so important. And I think that my experience in other organizations hasn't always been the same. I always haven't felt valued, right? Maybe because it was something cultural, something in the way that I was brought up. But here, I think it's actually very different. And so I personally feel very valued, and my experience as a young child is really the driving force around why I really do not want more children to be growing up facing barriers that I had to face, right? And so if I can do that, if I can work towards that, I think that in a lot of ways, I feel a lot of satisfaction, and it really, I think, continues to just add more, fuel to what I like to think of is like a fire, right? In me, and I'm not alone in doing this kind of work.
You said your childhood experiences drive your work, and I want to acknowledge something too. I tell this story often. I think it drives my work. I was born in Miami, Florida. My parents are immigrants from Nicaragua, and so they came to this country in '81, and then I surprised them a couple of years later. They didn't think they would have another kid, and here I show up. My mom was an educator in Nicaragua, and when she came to this country, she wanted to teach. And so she started all over again, right? My dad was an accountant in Nicaragua, and when he came to this country, he became a warehouse worker, right? He became somebody like, a handyman, so to speak, in certain times. Like he did the odd jobs. My mom could go to school and continue to learn and to advance. And I remember she graduated from the University of Miami eventually with the PhD in Spanish literature, and her first teaching job was in Spokane, Washington. And so we drove 3,000 miles away from Miami, Florida, to Spokane. I was flabbergasted because in Miami, I grew up in a world where, like, being Latino, being Hispanic, we're in the majority. So, like, this was our country. This is like our, you speak Spanish, nobody like bats an eye. The conversation happens. The food's from all over the world. And then what I did not expect is leaving maybe Broward County, going into like Okeechobee. And I was like, what is this? This is not an America that I knew, right? But I'm reminded of my first day going into Linwood Elementary School in Spokane, Washington. I was nervous. I was scared, but, I had showered. I'd put on some cologne, and I was kind of excited to meet new friends. And the first interaction that I had that morning was with a young girl named Lindsay. And Lindsay looked at me and said, "I don't want to sit next to a dirty Mexican." And that was my first experience, my first real experience with this idea of our community not belonging or being othered in very different ways. And so, Celia, when you say that, like, it drives my work too, because I don't want to live in a world where our community is the other, right? I want to live in a world where our community thrives and belongs, and our students don't ever feel that sense of, I don't know, of not being included, right, in this work. So yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And I think, Paul, a question for you. I think about my own dad and how he is, as a dad. And I'm curious for you, like, did you ever feel like you could slack off? I mean, like, for real, like, did you ever feel like you could just, like, relax? Because I would be so annoyed with somebody constantly telling me, like, listen, si se puede.
My dad was pretty good, right? I mean, he pushed us. He pushed us hard, but he also knew when it was time to uplift us and to reassure us, and and so he was good like that. Life isn't just about it's about pushing people forward. It's about bringing people along with you, and so he was good about that. I think about some of the times in the work that we did, and he wasn't the man to give a whole lot of praise. He was kind of short on that, right? Because he expected people to work hard around him. But the biggest praise came when he gave you more responsibility to carry a bigger load. And so it's kind of funny because you end up doing more work, but you have a sense that you come into your own and that you're being entrusted with work of La Causa. And so that was always reassuring. So yeah, it was kind of an interesting thing. During Easter and Christmas, it was always nice because he was dad and he was tata to the kids, right? And so that always made it a little bit easier. But but when you worked with him, he really did expect a lot from people. And I think especially with young Latinos and Latinas, because I think that they've been told for so many years that they weren't worth a lot. And I think that he wanted to make it a point that he was gonna, if he was gonna make a mistake, it was gonna be in pushing people too hard, because he really believed at the end of the day that What we lacked wasn't brains. What we lacked was opportunity. And his job then was to go out and give people opportunities to contribute to his work.
Wow, that's another gem right there. What we like is not brains, it's opportunity. I think you also we were talking about representation. You mentioned Westminster, and I think it's really fascinating. So we're in Kansas City, Missouri. We are a couple hours east of Topeka, where Brown Board of Education took place. And, I find it fascinating that we hear a lot about Brown, right? We hear a lot about Brown versus Board and the impact on our educational system, whatnot. But it was based on the precedent that Mendes versus Westminster made. And, it was a really, I think for me, a powerful moment for like this idea around Black and Brown coalition building, right? Like, had it not been for Mendes, we wouldn't have had Brown versus Board. And so this idea of how we must work together in the struggle is powerful. Celia, I'm curious, as you continue to build out, you said 1 million students, right? And I assume it's not just 1 million Latino students. It's 1 million students regardless of their race, ethnicity, and whatnot.
That's correct.
How do you build that cultural competency amongst folks who aren't Latino, or may not resonate with this from that identity perspective?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think that, when I think about Cesar's core values, right, I actually really, I think that in the way that he, presented himself and the way that he understood that he wasn't going to be able to do this work alone, and it would take a community, it would take a coalition. That's the way that I think about our work as well, right? How do we, because I think that our mission is actually very complementary to a lot of organizations that are doing really important work. And so I think that my job is to figure out, like, what are those synergies, right? Understand that we can't be good at everything, right? And that we definitely have a wheelhouse and we have some strengths, but other folks do too. So how do I think about, building those bridges with other organizations, with other people that have those same affinities, right? And work toward what I like to really think about. It's actually a common vision for all children, right? So that's the way that I personally think about and look at, what history has taught us, particularly from this particular kind of, standpoint. And so diversity and inclusion is so important for us. And I just think that there is no path forward if you actually don't see as that being part of the journey forward.
I appreciate that. I think oftentimes there's this narrative, right, of this idea of crabs in a barrel, that we all are fighting for small pieces of the pie. It's also a good reminder that, like, there's abundance there, right? There's more than enough for everybody, particularly if we learn how to work together and learn how to align our struggle in ways. I'm gonna pivot just a little bit, Paul, and feel free to say, no, Edgar, I don't want to answer this question, but I think about the importance of family in our community. And, I'm curious, I have a phenomenal wife, Laura Palacios, who like completely, like pushes me and like you just make sure that I'm always, she's the si se puede person in my life of pushing me and maybe pushing me a little too hard sometimes. Don't tell her I said that. I'm curious about your mom. What was her experience like through this? How did she clearly was integral in this work?
Well, thank you for asking, because I've been thinking about my mom and dad a lot these last couple of days, right, during the holiday season. My mother's background was very similar to my father's. She was a Chicana. She was born in the Imperial Valley, a little town called Brawley, just probably 30 miles from the Mexican border. They ended up in the Central Valley of California in agriculture because they had to follow the crops. That was how they lived. She grew up in a converted horse barn, and like my father, her education stopped in high school. She was a sophomore in high school when she stopped working because she needed to help my abuelita feed her other brothers and sisters. She wasn't making enough. And so she suffered the indignities of working in the fields along with hundreds of thousands of other people. My father, the goal of farm workers, and like the goal of people that work in tough jobs, is to get out of that industry and make sure that your kids never have to do what you had to do, right? That's just, it's a universal aspiration. Well, my father was able to actually get out of the fields. He became a community organizer. He was working with a group called the Community Services Organization. It was during its time in the late 40s and 50s. It was the most progressive, active, militant Latino, Chicano civil rights organization. They did a lot of work in urban centers in rural areas of California. They registered 500,000 voters and elected Ed Roybal to the city council of Los Angeles. They fought police brutality and they did a lot of good work. My father had become an organizer, and he quickly moved up the ranks and became the staff director. And so my father was living a comfortable middle class life. I see some of those photographs from back in the day, and my father's wearing a Brooks Brothers suit, and he has a little skinny Clark Gable mustache, and his hair is parted and slicked back, right? And my mother's there, all haitona, as my aunts would say, in gowns and stuff from these different events they went to. But my mother would tell us that my dad would go on organizing trips, and he would come home and he would say, "I saw people working, bent over all day, working in terrible conditions. It's not right. Somebody should do something." And he continued to say that until one day my mom said, "Why don't you do something about it?" And then they had that conversation. He says, "If I move back, we're not going to have security." They had 8 small children. He goes, "We're not going to have the economic security we have. You're probably going to have to go back and work in the fields to provide for the kids, and I'm going to be gone a lot." And my mom says, "Listen, I said that I share the same anger that you share about the indignities that we suffered. I'm behind you. If you want to do it, I'm prepared to make that commitment." And so she did. And so when we moved and he gave up that job, my mother raised 8 kids that were growing. I think at that time, my brother Fernando was probably 13 years old, and the youngest one was probably 2 years old. She went and she worked back in the fields, and she'd come back and take care of us. And then we had a mimeograph, and she would be there with my older brothers and sisters doing leaflets, boxes of leaflets.
Mhm.
And then, my father would take us on weekends, and we would go in leaflet towns up and down the Central Valley. But my mother was the glue that held us together. Once things began to develop, one of the first programs that we developed was a credit union for farm workers, the first credit union in the history of the United States. And my mother was the general manager for the credit union that during its lifetime made small loans, and probably during its life lent out over $25 million in loans to needy farm workers. And so my mother played a big role in it, but it just wasn't my mother, and it just wasn't men. There was a lot of women that played tough roles in this work. People like Dolores Huerta, of course, but people like Fina Hernandez and Esther Uranday and Jessica Govea, and just a whole slew of tough women that lived that same experience and were just as angry about conditions and dedicated their lives to making a difference. So it's important that we remember them and their contributions.
Celia, can you talk a little bit about the power of Latina women today and the work that they're doing to create equitable equity within our communities?
Yeah.
And I assume you yourself are a powerful Latina as well. So,
Well,
Yes,
I
she
always
is.
say that thank you, Paul. Well, I always say that I stand on the shoulders of giants. I've had I think I've really been blessed with being able to meet, very strong women who had a mindset of like, hey, I'm going to bring other women along. And I think that spans from like my own friends to just, where I've worked, whether it has been peers or maybe even my own managers. I think that has been particularly a very very true in my, I think, experience, which I know that that's not always the case, but it has been for me. And so I always lead from that kind of space, and where I'm like, I want to always think about that, right? It's like, how do I bring other women along with me, understanding that we also face a lot of barriers, particularly because we are a double minority, right? Not only as a Latina, but also as a woman. And so I think that that is something that I am very always intentional about thinking about. But yeah, like I said, I stand on the shoulders of very powerful women. And in my work, what I try to do is really seek out, leaders that I personally really am connected to their core values, right? And think about the work that they're doing, and try to strike up, relationships, and sometimes try to, become friends with folks, just because I think that, especially in the education sector, I don't see a lot of Latina women out there, right, in terms of leading the work. But I also know that there's a lot of Latina women that are doing the work too, right? So that's the way that I personally really, really think about it. But like I said, I lead through that lens. That lens is really, really important to me. I know that I talk to Paul a lot about that too, right? As I think about the work in our foundation, and how do we support women and make sure that we are thinking about actively removing those barriers, right, in order to make sure that we have a diversity of perspectives in that regard. And so from a foundation perspective, I think, the names that Paul was sharing around those women that were very influential in our work, there are properties that are named after them, right? So that legacy continues to live. And I think it's so awesome and amazing that we are able to see those names and understand, right, their contributions that they've been able to make to the work. And so I think that in itself is very, it's very, I think, liberating, right, to be able to, and also empowering at the same time.
Right.
I really have enjoyed this conversation. We are nearing our time together, but before we exit this space, I do want to make sure that we play the correct video foundation. And so, Ivan, if you're back there, go ahead and cue it up for us so we can learn a little bit more about the work that's currently happening at the Cesar Chavez Foundation.
The year was 1962. On March 31st, the same day as his birthday, Cesar Chavez resigned from a civil rights group called the Community Service Organization and moved his family to Delano, California. There, he began building the United Farmworkers, launching a movement that paved the way for today's Cesar Chavez Foundation. Cesar's vision was simple: a workers' union that would help people overcome their burdens of poverty, discrimination, and powerlessness they suffered at their work and in their communities. That's why Cesar and his colleagues established the first credit union for farmworkers, a death benefit program to help workers with funeral and burial expenses, and a co-op gas station to ease the burden of daily transportation. During the 1960s, he founded an organization to support families by building affordable housing, providing educational services, and creating a network of educational radio stations. That organization would become the Cesar Chavez Foundation, continuing his legacy of social change by improving the quality of life for millions of people. Through housing and economic development, the Cesar Chavez Foundation provides high-quality, affordable housing for thousands of working families and seniors across California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. These communities create lasting and transformational change across generations. In 1983, Cesar founded Radio Campesina, a radio station dedicated to educating and entertaining listeners. It has grown to become a multi-platform communications group, reaching more than 1 million people through informative and entertaining content that promotes community action. Cesar envisioned an educational system in which all students can thrive and engage with their communities. The Cesar Chavez Foundation is dedicated to transforming education so that all children can experience high-quality learning to reach their full potential. Cesar's work continues in Keene, California, on the grounds where he labored and lived during the last half of his life. It is home to the National Chavez Center, which preserves and promotes his legacy. The Via La Paz Conference and Event Center fulfills his dream of a place where people can gather and educate future generations of dedicated activists. The property is also home to the Cesar E. Chavez National Monument, the final resting place of Cesar and his wife Helen. Cesar's struggle began as a fight for social justice that grew beyond the fields to include the modern-day struggles and needs of people everywhere. The The Cesar Chavez Foundation carries on Cesar's vision by uplifting the lives of Latinos and working families, inspiring and transforming communities.
Once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore.
What a powerful video. What a powerful video. I'm so, again, humbled by being in your presence and talking about this work. As we exit the conversation, I'm going to ask a future thinking question. So I'm going to start with Celia. Celia, what is your hope for the Latino community?
Well, my hope, and I think I'll make this pretty short and sweet, is that, you know, in my lifetime, that we just stop talking about the challenges that we're facing now, right? That I actually want to see that we are able to make change, and that change is led by the people that are most impacted. So I want to see this at the forefront, making that change in, you know, disrupting systems of oppression, particularly in the area of education, that we are at the table and that we're making decisions and in designing, right, with our children, right, at the forefront and in our hearts.
Paul, I'll ask you the same question. What hope do you have for our community?
You know, my hope is that our children will assume their rightful place in the communities in which we live and we make prosperous, and that they'll become leaders and they'll participate in the civic and social and political affairs of our communities. You know, my dad always said that the fight's never about lettuce or grapes. It's always about people. And in thinking about the future, it's got to be about the role that our children and our families play in the societies in which we live and work.
It's never about lettuce or grapes. It's about people. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us today, this evening, and joining us in conversation. Some takeaways for me, really, around this idea: if you don't give up, the fight continues. That is such a great mantra to wake up to every day, right? Because it is absolutely a choice. You can choose not to work, right? You can choose not to struggle in certain ways, but you can choose to like show up and be present and fight, and that's a really powerful takeaway. Thank you again for both of you and for being here with us and doing what you do. Any final takeaways? Anything that you want to add that we may have not covered? A funny quote, a joke that you like. Paul, I heard you like funny jokes, Paul, so I don't know if you can share one with the community or not.
Actually, I'm not any good at jokes. That's why I'm always asking people to share. No, I want to thank you for inviting us to be with you this discussion, and also I want to congratulate you on the work that you're doing. I know that you know the fight for social justice can be hard. And sometimes, you know, we can ask ourselves, why am I doing this? But the fact that you and the folks that you work with have chosen to step up and address this educational equity issue is something that's important. My dad would say that you're doing God's work. And so we want to congratulate you on the good work that you're doing, and ánimo. There's a lot of work to be done.
I appreciate that so much. You have no idea. Well, thank you, Celia. Thank you, Paul. Thank you to our community for joining us this evening. This has been quite a treat, but we look forward to seeing you at one of our next events coming up. Again, I'm Edgar Palacios with Revolución Educativa, working on building collective sustained power within the Latino community around issues of education. Thank you both, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.